Now I'm back, I think. So this is the book that we're taking a look at now. It's Is God Evil by Dr. Corey Miller, our CEO of Ratio Christi. And yeah, so oh my goodness, I actually typed up those notes because I needed them, but I didn't make a hard copy for myself. So let me go back to that screen. Uh, I love being disorganized. Is this inspiring you, John? This could be. Okay, so he sets up the problem, is God evil, by talking about some of the philosophers that ask questions about it and make accusations about it after the attack on 9/11, the link between moral equivocation of radical Islam, of the terrorists that were accused in that, with Jesus being Jewish, and linking Jesus with the genocide of the Old Testament and with the slavery of the Old Testament at large. Um, but his he quotes the famous tirade by Richard Dawkins as well about the God of the Old Testament is, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, genocide, misogynist, and so forth. Quite a long list of diatribe on that. But in his introduction, he also says that other people have to deal with the problem of whether or not there is a good or an evil God as well. So, when talking about atheism's view of objective morality, he talks about the difference between a preference of I like chocolate ice cream versus human trafficking is wrong for all times and all places versus being true of your personal preference that you may like ice cream, just to distinguish between um, making an absolute moral truth claim. And so one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting in this is his definition of different topics for um, moral evil, like rape, murder, and human sex trafficking, which I think is a good tack to go on because a lot of people will relate to that. So anyway, uh, his two big divisions in the book are on Old Testament slavery and Old Testament genocide, and he does have some quotes from primary sources like Dawkins and Roos, Michael Roos, and others in their attempts to explain things. Alex Rosenberg and kind of his moralism. Uh, but one of the things that I think was interesting about the case for slavery in the Old Testament, and he does have a summary page after each of those two large sections, um, where he goes through and he looks at each one of the different slavery texts that seem to be quite insulting to our sensibilities about slavery. But he says the Old Testament concept was really more of indentured servitude, and talks about the same sort of thing happening with people who came to the free world from England, that their ship passage fare would need to be paid back and they couldn't afford to do it. And so they would sell themselves into indentured servanthood to pay it off. He does kind of a survey of slavery through the Old Testament. It talks about the sabbatical years where they could only work as an indentured servant for 6 years. Talks about people being created in the image of God, so they're not viewed as property, even though I think it might have been Christopher Hitchens that he quotes saying that they were no more valuable than a farm utensil. Not so, says Miller. They had laws against kidnapping, so the whole thing about the Underground Railroad and the American slavery experiment, the 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 comparison doesn't really line up. It's more apples and oranges because actually the Jews were encouraged to not return runaway slaves. And he also talks about the image of God, that was voluntary, indentured, and the hard times. I mean, when you're living in an agrarian culture where the bottom falls out with pestilence or a crop failure or something like that, you really are quite destitute. And the purpose of the indentured servanthood laws was to help them get their feet. And the whole Sabbath year and Jubilee would also be a return of property. There's more on this, but I think that those are some good starting places for a discussion with people about that. Now, on the second half of the book, on the Old Testament and genocide, he really quotes a lot from two sources. One is Paul Copan, who I actually heard at a conference in Chicagoland talking about this, and he was in agreement substantially with a guy named Walton, I think, he publishes on InterVarsity Press, not mentioned in the book. But anyway, about some of the things about hyperbole, that when they go and utterly destroy them, and he went and he utterly destroyed them, that it really is kind of tracking in hyperbole, because we find out that the Canaanites are still there later on. He didn't draw out this illustration, but the same can be said of King David utterly destroying all the Amalekites. And then a few chapters later, you say, oh, the Amalekites are still taking over too. So there is some case for the hyperbole thing. Copan also says the purpose wasn't genocidal, but to drive the inhabitants out of the land. That's one of his corrective points. And but Clay Jones is a little more strong on that the purpose was judgment, that some of the Canaanite sins were so grievous and included bestiality, child torture, imitating the gods, and the Canaanite gods are notorious for evil behavior. But he says we shouldn't be so I don't know, centurious. I don't know, he didn't say centurious, but looking back and saying, oh, the big bad Canaanites, when we have abortion. And he actually draws out some parables about our own culture and some of the brutalities that we have. Then he asks the question about if God is not judging, then we say, where is God? And then if he does judge, then we say we didn't like the way that he judged. But he does believe that part of the purpose of Joshua was actually to punish the Canaanites as well. And he quotes the Genesis talking about the number of years in which the sin of the Amalekites was not complete. One of the, and this also has a summary page on page 24, where he summarizes the points that God did not commit genocide in the Old Testament. He was concerned with sin, not ethnicity or race. He's patient, but eventually grace rejected is grace denied. In the case of the Canaanites, we see abundant reasons for God judging. And so one of the other things he mentioned is that God's attitude towards the Canaanites. And, the book of Judges is like one of my favorite books in the Bible as far as the good guys, and they're so morally compromised. But the fact that Rahab, a harlot in Canaanite culture, repents and seeks sanctuary. And she has a son named Boaz, who is one of the shining lights during the period of the Judges, and marries Ruth, a Moabitess, also from the land. So these instances of God's grace and big picture. But one of the things I wanted to say here is who would be the sort of people, the typo was on page 23, where it says foreigners like Naomi and Rahab. Naomi was not a foreigner. Naomi was Israelite. He meant to say Ruth and Rahab, and for that matter, Boaz, who's a shining light as well. But one of the things I wanted to point out in this book is I really like Clay Jones, and his book Immortality also deals with some of these issues. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, but just very well written. And the other thing is, what kinds of people might you use this booklet with when you're tabling on campus? Tabling on campus, who would even ask a question like, is God evil? Well, I think a lot of people would if they were being candid and we gave them permission to and create a safe space for it. People dealing with unanswered prayer about things that God should obviously care about and answer on their timetable. People in pain or hard circumstances or poverty. People in prison with dependencies, substance abuse, physical, emotional abuse. So for tabling tip for the use of this, empathize. You can even make the case stronger because we do believe in moral absolutes. So when people say, well, I think God was maybe a little bit off the hook there, and they don't want to talk like moral absolutes, you said, come on, put it out on the table. You can say that's stronger than that, and lean into it, because I think the ultimate injustice, which isn't so much developed here, but it is developed in Clay's book, is the cross of Christ. But I wanted to give you two extra points, not in the booklet, that I think are also helpful. And slavery is an issue, because we Americans are very driven about slavery. And one of them is the whole issue. I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning of the outline. One of the missing points is the critical theory, critical race theory, critical queer theory, critical feminist theory, accusation. And that is the whole issue of power. So when it comes to genocide, when it comes to slavery, the way most postmoderns and millennials are approaching it is not from the viewpoint of morality, but from the viewpoint of injustice related to power. And so you want to be sensitive to that as well. But one of the things I encourage students that were discussing this booklet the other day at Purdue to do was to propose a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this, because I've done this experiment myself when I was upset with God and feeling that God was evil. And that is, if there is a God and God is evil, why can I, as a fallen, finite, fallible, frail human being, come up with a world that's more sadomasochistic, torturous, and brutal? Why taste buds? Why visions of color? Why the Grand Canyon? Why the birth of a child? Why is he so incompetent of creating a world that is ultimately evil? So it's just an interesting thought experiment, and the resource from the board member again is Clay Jones. And I think I'll wrap up. I think I may wrap up a little bit early on this. I don't know. I may have gone a little bit over time, but I'll give you a chance to do some pushback with me on the book. And I think it's a good one. It's a little bit off kilter, asking people the question, is God evil, and allowing them to entertain that for a bit. But I think it could be a good conversation starter at a book table. All right, so I'm back to you guys. Feel free to unmute yourself. I see there's some comments here I missed while I was chattering here. Truth is reducible to a power struggle, and God is omnipotent, and everything he says is true. That's good.
There's a point that Dr. Baggett, getting back to him, he makes, because he deals with more higher level arguments for God's existence and things like that. But as it pertains to, he realizes there's obviously issues when it comes to the narrative, the conquest narratives and things like that. But he makes a distinction that might be helpful for conversations that at least initially start. Doesn't cover the whole thing, but at least helpful. He makes a distinction between things that are difficult and impossible to explain. So just because it's a difficulty doesn't mean it's impossible. And he gives the entailment. He says if A entails B and B entails C, the transitive entailment. If A entails B and B entails C, and B and C are consistent, then A and C are also consistent. So the way that he fleshes this out in this way is, he says, similarly, if the salvation history affected by a perfectly loving God allows in certain extremely unusual circumstances for a conquest, then God's perfect goodness in such a conquest are at least in principle possibly consistent. So he's basically saying if we have an independent argument for God's loving character, then that also covers the difficulty of conquest narratives and things like that. So that's at least a good starting point. If you have arguments for God's omnibenevolence and things like that, then that at least in principle logically covers some of these issues, even though I still believe you must flesh these out as Copan and everybody else does.
I like the way you say it pastorally as well, because it gives empathy for the discussion. In doing a rapid blitzkrieg through the booklet, especially emotional issues, it can seem like you're just a computer Bible answer man person. We're saying, yeah, it is difficult. It's difficult. We can own that, but not impossible. And so the syllogism you had for that might escape some people, but still, it's useful. It's a useful tool. Thanks.
It's I got that from his it's in the 24 or so arguments for God. the book that was based off of Plantinga. I can share the screen really quick if people want to look at it, just so you can see the fulfillment. 1 second here.
While he's looking for it, does anybody else have a question, comment, pushback?
You know, Joe, it's interesting how, as far as slavery is concerned in the Old Testament, discussing it, there's never a discussion about Jeremiah 31 and how the nation of Israel was sent into exile because they actually mistreated their slaves.
Yeah.
That was the reason why they went into exile, because they released the slaves as the prophets told them to do, and then they went back and gathered them back to themselves. And God said, "Okay, I've had it. You're going into exile." So they like to be selective. The critics of the Old Testament like to be selective with the texts they use. They don't use all of the texts.
That's one of those gotcha things. I've heard people say this about Haman gets hanged on his own hanger, but Agag, who was the king under, a friend of the king at the time of Nehemiah, is apparently an Amalekite who had descendants that were supposed to be exterminated, and now they're seeking the annihilation of Israel. And people say, well, the Canaanites wouldn't have defiled the Jewish people with their culture. God didn't need to be so extreme. But as you said, yeah, even in that case, which is a mild one, going back and capturing it versus some of the other thing in the book of Judges and some of the things that Jeremiah describes what was going on in the temple, it was clearly Canaanite compromise, is amazing. I think that's a good point.
Good job, Joe. Very good job. And you were 3 minutes under, actually. I was proud of you. Someone who is so talented at being a good speaker.
Oh, that's something out. Here, I wanted to show you my new hat. Can you read? If you get your theism right and you believe there's a good God, it solves a lot of problems.